Hello, welcome back for this new video. So this video will be a bit different from the other ones. I will not talk about a specific ICS cybersecurity topic, but I will make some kind of feedback or minutes of the S4 conference that happened last week. So a few words about the conference. It's dedicated to ICS cybersecurity, so this is not so common. There are only, I would say, a few cybersecurity conferences that really focus on ICS. The conference is held in Miami South Beach, so I have to admit that it's quite a nice location. The weather was superb. It lasts for 3 days, and there is always a mix of high-level talks, mostly on what is called the main stage, and some deep technical talks. So probably those are the ones that I like the most, on what is called stage 2. So it's, I would say, a slightly smaller stage, but that still allows speakers to really have a great audience for their amazing talks. So I will guide you through a few of the talks that I really appreciated. Of course, I was not able to attend all the talks, and of course I was not able to include all the talks in this video, so only a subset of what I liked during the conference. Of course, I will start with Wavestone conference, and in particular the conference of Alexandrine, my colleague from Wavestone. So she explained, she compared, I would say, two types of ICS architecture. The first one, which you could call, I would say, the historical one that you use for large facilities located in one location, like a refinery, for example. And the architecture that we have to use today for newer types of ICS in the energy sector, so maybe wind farms or solar farms. So of course those are way more distributed. So the question was, can we apply exactly the same architecture? Does it make sense? And of course the answer was no. And what I liked about this talk is the fact that all this reasoning was based on some kind of classification on the risk level of those different ICS installations. And of course, the risk on solar or wind farms is very different from the ones in a refinery. And so that's why you have to, I would say, adapt the architecture and be a little more open about using newer technologies like SD-WAN when it makes sense. Second talk that I really appreciated was the one from Jens Wiesner from the BSI, so it's a German cybersecurity government agency, and the talk was about CSAF. So if you watch my previous videos, you probably noticed that vulnerability management is one of the topics I quite like and I find very difficult to master in ICS. I mean, it's too complex, it's too time consuming. And CSAF may be one of the solutions. So it tries to, I would say, solve a problem that we have today, that we have lots and lots of security advisories from a lot of different vendors coming from a lot of different places. And on top of all of that, in a lot of different formats, HTML, PDF, TXT, it's really difficult to be able to, I would say, do an analysis of the security advisory at large scale. So what is CSAF? It's an open standard that allows you, for example, as a product manufacturer or as a software vendor, to have, I would say, a machine-readable version of your security advisories. And so in a JSON format, you can have all the information related to the vulnerability, the products that are affected, the exact versions. You can also use CSAF to contact your client and say that you are not vulnerable to a specific vulnerability. Recent example with, for example, Log4j, it was a very widespread vulnerability, but a lot of products, they didn't rely at all on Java, so they were not affected. And so CSAF is one way that you can easily send the information out and say, okay, my product doesn't use Java, I'm not affected by a Log4j vulnerability, for example. And so in an ideal scenario, as an operator working for an, I would say, an asset owner, you will have a specific solution to download all those CSAF files. So that could be directly from your vendor, from a trusted provider, or maybe by a third-party company like a CERT providing aggregation services for all your products. Then you have to match, I would say, the product mentioned in the CSAF file with your asset inventory. And then you can use SSVC, Stakeholder Specific Vulnerability Categorization. If you do not know what that is, I strongly recommend that you watch my video on the topic to decide what you do and then document the action in the asset inventory. So the idea is really to make the life of operators and asset owners, I would say, as a whole, way easier by trying as much as possible to automate the security advisories, I would say, analysis, and to provide a workflow that is, I would say, actionable for the asset owners. And at the moment, trying to go to all the different websites, reading a lot of different mailing lists is not the best way to do that, quite frankly. Okay, now another talk that I really like, PLC EDR. So that's a very interesting title. EDR stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. However, this talk was not about endpoint protection, nor detection, nor response, so it was a bit weird. However, it was really interesting. The idea of this talk was to say, I want to perform some kind of analysis of the logic or the code running on my PLC to be able to query it and identify if a specific situation, for example, a dangerous situation in terms of safety, is possible or not. To do that, the people from Nozomi, they developed some kind of model checking Python code that allowed them to ingest a Rockwell ladder logic file, process this file, and then it allows you to perform some queries. As you can see, for example, the query that is written on the slide is up motor and down motor. So that means you have two different and opposite actions on the same actuator. So of course that's something you do not want, because you do not know how the PLC will react if it's supposed to at the same time run the motor in one direction and the other one. So it's really quite difficult. And so this model checking software allows you to find if there is a possible way in your code. So that means it will identify which state of the inputs, for example, and the variables will lead to this event. Or maybe, if everything works correctly, it will tell you that there is no trace to reach this specific query. So I thought that was really, really interesting. I think that in terms of safety, some people are already selling that type of software, but it would be really interesting to have that maybe released as an open source or directly embedded into the integrated development environment provided by the vendor. So for example, for Rockwell, I think it's RSLink or RSLogic, I do not remember exactly, or TIA Portal for Siemens, for example. That would be really, really interesting. Second point that they mention is to try to check the equivalence of two ladder logic files. So for example, let's say you want to update the code of your PLC. Well, you can simply run this software before and after and see if there are some different situations. So if, for example, if a new attack path arrives on your, I would say, on your PLC. So really quite interesting. Of course, that's not something that you can directly use because they do not plan on releasing that solution. But I thought that was really, really interesting, especially in terms of safety. I'm not a safety specialist. I guess that type of software already exists on safety systems, but I am not 100% sure. Okay, next talk was really, really funny story. Funny, maybe it depends on where you stand, but very interesting at least. It's called Unpawning a Building. And so the situation started by a client calling these people and saying, okay, we have lost complete loss of the control of the building automation system. That means light, HVAC, the shutters, etc. So in this building, it was I would say a fairly modern building. Everything was connected to a KNX network. So it's some kind of home automation specific protocol. And by analyzing, I would say, the network packets and trying to connect to the KNX devices, the researcher, or I would say the consultants, were able to to find out that what happened is that there was an external attack on this building, and that the attacker used, I would say, a very obscure feature of the KNX protocol that's called the BCU key. It's some kind of security feature that allows you to configure the devices in a way that they will only answer to specific queries that include the BCU key. So that means once it is set, as the attacker, you will not be able to change the value of a device unless you know the BCU key. So it's, I would say, standard authentication feature. The problem is, on this building, this feature was not used at all, and so the attacker defined a key, so the legitimate user didn't know the key, then the attacker left, and there was no easy way to restore the devices. So it was really a complex thing to do, and so they tried to retrieve the key from some of the compromised devices. So they were able to identify some of the devices that were, I would say, from a hardware hacking point of view, less protected than the others, and they were able to some extent brute force the key. So it was not possible to directly brute force the key because it was too slow. So what they did is just dump the memory of one of the devices. They knew the key length, and so using a sliding window, they used all the content of the memory to try that as a dictionary for the brute force. And so luckily they were able to retrieve the key, and the same key was set on all the devices. Of course, should the situation have been different, specific key for each device, it wouldn't have been possible at all to restore everything back to normal for this building. So it's the first time I hear about that. Apparently the case was not isolated. There were several cases in Germany where buildings were attacked in this way, and for some reason there was no ransom, so it was not a financial motive. So really I have no idea why the attackers did that, but it was really big impact on the people using the building, of course. Another very interesting talk on PLCs. So this was a talk from Gloria Cedillo from Dragos, and she explained how she developed a specific library for Rockwell PLCs to allow some security monitoring of those devices. And so it's very linked to the top 20 PLC secure coding guidelines. So it's a topic that I know quite a bit. Myself, I did a talk 2 days ago at the ICS JWG on the topic. It's quite similar. Of course, from a technical point of view, this was, I would say, much more advanced, because instead of trying to find pieces of code, they really developed a reusable library that you can implement on all, I would say, your Rockwell PLC, to be able to monitor a lot of things, like, for example, the switch key, the one that defines if you can remotely program the PLC or not, for example, but also to monitor, I would say, a modification of the firmware, a program download, things like that. So it's really interesting and very similar to what I did at the ICS JWG, and that I will also do at the upcoming SANS ICS Summit. Next, maybe the most technical talk. So that was perhaps a bit too technical for me in terms of, I would say, embedded systems exploitation, but it was really well explained, so I was able to follow on the approach. So those people from Clarity, they try to compromise a Siemens PLC, and by compromise, I do not mean being able to change the code and bypass the security features, but directly to execute code as the kernel, so really having, I would say, a full access to the device. To do so, they did a lot of reverse engineering on the TIA portal as well as the PLC firmware to identify exactly what was uploaded when you upload a new code and how it is interpreted by the PLC. So then they tried to identify a way to jump from the application layer directly to the kernel. So they did that by using a legitimate function code from the Siemens TIA portal. And then what, of course, this function allowed to copy code from one place to another. Of course, there are some specific, I would say, security features that prevent to write some code in the memory in specific zones. But by reversing the firmware, they were able to use one specific or two specific functions that allowed to copy memory without any kind of boundary check. And so by doing that, they were able to directly execute code, some shell code in the kernel. So for example, to dump the firmware, even if it's encrypted. And they would also be able to actually to control the PLC without having to change the program. So what I mentioned before about monitoring the PLC would be quite useless in this specific example, because they could directly monitor the inputs and outputs of the PLC without having to use the PLC code or to change the PLC code at all. So of course, really good discovery from Clarity. Of course, as I mentioned, there were many other talks and events as part of the conference. So there was the PLC Top 20 training by Vivek. There was a talk on EveOS, which is an open source approach to operating system for edge devices. A talk on IEC 62443 product certification, so ISA Secure, for example, on assessing the balance between visibility and confidentiality. So should you try to encrypt everything in your ICS, yes or no? Of course, the very famous welcome party that is held at the Miami Botanic Garden, and so they rolled cigars in front of you. It's really nice. There was also a great CTF that enabled. I was able to play a little bit, but I would say that considering the price of the conference, I wanted to attend the talks primarily, but I did a few of the challenges. It was really quite fun, and they had nice oil rig, a small setup, so it was really nice. And of course, Beer Isaac, which is, I would say, a very chill event on which you can meet a lot of people from the conference and drink a beer or any kind of soft drink that you want. And so overall, it was a really nice experience for me. That was my third time at S4. I plan on attending next year as well. So next year, I think that it will be held from February 14 to 16, something like that. So, well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and maybe see you at S4 next year.